The night air was a cold blade against the boss's skin, but his resolve was colder. He had spent years carving a path of wreckage through the underworld, fueled by the memory of the lost heir he believed was gone forever. Now, as he scaled the perimeter wall of his rival's estate, he didn't expect mercy. He expected a bloodbath. He was the world's most dangerous man, a shadow moving through the darkness with a heart full of vengeance, ready to finally end a lifelong gang war. He cleared the ledge with the silent grace of a predator, his finger tightening on the trigger as he scanned for guards. But the staccato of gunfire never came. Instead, a soft, melodic laugh drifted through the air, cutting through his rage like a miracle. Below him lay the heart of enemy territory, a place that should have been a fortress of steel and malice. Instead, the moonlight revealed a sprawling, manicured garden where the scent of blooming roses fought against the metallic tang of his own violent history. The boss remained frozen in the shadows, his eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the soft glow of the garden lights. He had come for revenge, prepared to burn this legacy to the ground, but the sight before him stayed in his hand. In the center of the garden, sitting cross-legged among the petals, was a young woman. She was older than the faded memory tucked into the boss's heart, but there was no mistaking the line of her jaw. It was her. The daughter he had buried in his mind was alive. She wasn't a prisoner. To the boss's utter disbelief, she was calmly commanding a golden retriever puppy. The small animal barked with excitement, tripping over its paws as it chased a ball she had tossed. She laughed again, a sound so pure it felt like a physical blow to the boss's chest. The vengeance in his heart instantly vanished, replaced by a silent moment of awe. He watched as she leaned forward, whispering praise to the dog, her fingers buried in its golden fur. As the deadliest of enemies stood hidden in the dark, he found himself torn between starting a war and shedding tears. He hadn't just found his daughter. He had found a reason to stop fighting. Subscribe and hit the bell, because this story is only getting started. The city below was a jagged landscape of concrete and neon, but to Vittorio, it was nothing more than a graveyard he had built one headstone at a time. His reputation was not merely a name spoken in hushed tones, it was a cold, suffocating weight that pressed down on the streets. Men didn't just fear him, they feared the void where his soul used to be. For 10 years, the boss had moved through the world as a phantom of industry and iron, a ruthless leader who had scrubbed every trace of warmth from his life until only the sharp edges of tactical precision remained. He was the world's most dangerous man, not because he loved the violence, but because he no longer had anything else to live for. The grief was a long shadow that stretched back to a single blood-soaked afternoon a decade ago. It was a day of smoke and screeching tires, a day when his daughter, his only heir, had vanished into the ether. For years, that silence had been a deafening roar in his ears. He had spent millions on private investigators, burned down rival warehouses, and interrogated every lowlife from the docks to the penthouses, yet the trail had remained frozen. Everyone assumed she was dead, a casualty of the lifelong gang war that defined his existence. Vittorio had played the part of the grieving father until the grief turned into a hard, obsidian shell of vengeance. Tonight, as he prepared to breach the final sanctuary of his greatest enemy, that old agony felt like a sharpened stake. Every step toward the rival's estate was a step taken for a ghost. He didn't want money or territory anymore. He wanted to see the light leave his rival's eyes, a mirrored payment for the light that had gone out of his own life when his daughter disappeared. He was a man driven by a clear goal and a deep flaw. He believed that by destroying everything he could finally find peace. He moved through the darkness, a predator defined by loss, never imagining that the shadow he had walked in for 10 years was about to be shattered by the most impossible sight. The night air tasted of salt and impending ozone, a silent herald of the storm Vittorio was about to unleash. He moved with the calculated, predatory stillness that had made him a legend in the underworld, his silhouette blending seamlessly into the jagged architecture of the estate's outer perimeter. This was the heart of enemy territory, a fortress that had mocked him from across the city's skyline for years, but tonight the most dangerous man in the world was no longer content with distance. He was a ghost in carbon fiber and matte black steel, scaling the towering perimeter wall with a rhythmic precision that defied the heavy weight of his grief. Every muscle was tuned to the frequency of the hunt. He cleared the ledge of the stone barrier, his boots making no more sound than a falling leaf as they met the gravel path on the other side. Gun leveled and steady, his thumb traced the safety with a practiced flick, his eyes scanning the darkness for the thermal signatures of guards or the glint of security lenses. He expected a bloodbath. He expected the frantic shouts of sentries and the staccato rhythm of automatic fire to erupt at any second. The air should have been thick with the tension of a lifelong gang war, reaching its boiling point. Instead, the estate was eerie in its tranquility. Vittorio pressed his back against a cold marble pillar, his breath shallow and controlled as he bypassed a high-tech biometric sensor with a burst from a signal jammer. He moved deeper into the inner sanctum, weaving through the shadows of ancient oaks and sculpted hedges. He was a man prepared to burn a legacy to the ground, his mind a map of exit routes and kill zones. He had come for revenge, his heart a hollow chamber waiting to be filled with the echoes of his enemy's defeat. He approached the final courtyard, the rival's garden, expecting to find an assassin or a trap. Instead, he reached the edge of the rose bushes, his finger tight on the trigger, only to have the world tilt on its axis as his tactical focus shattered against an impossible reality. Vittorio exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his finger hovering over the trigger as he peered through the tangled skeleton of a rose trellis. He had come for a bloodbath, expecting to find his rival's throat or the barrel of an assassin's gun. Instead, the world's most dangerous man stood frozen in the shadows, witnessing an impossible sight that defied every law of the underworld he had helped build. There, bathed in the soft amber glow of the garden lanterns, was the miracle he had long ago surrendered to the earth. His missing daughter, the lost heir thought to be gone forever, was sitting calmly among the roses. She was no longer the small child of his fading photographs. She had grown in the years of her absence, her movements possessing a grace that felt like a quiet rebellion against the violence of her lineage. She was completely unaware that her father, a man who had burned cities in her name, was watching from the darkness, torn between starting a war and shedding tears. She wasn't a prisoner in this rival's garden, nor was she a target. She was simply a girl in a moment of peace, her attention entirely captured by a golden retriever puppy that gambled around her knees. As Vittorio watched, she gave a soft, commanding whistle, and the puppy sat with clumsy enthusiasm. She let out a laugh, a sound so bright and untainted that the vengeance in his heart instantly vanished. It was a silent moment of awe that could bridge a lifelong gang war, a sight that turned a hardened killer into a ghost of a father. He watched her stroke the dog's golden fur, her voice a low, melodic murmur that didn't belong in a house of his enemies. For 10 years he had lived for the kill, but as he stood hidden in the heart of enemy territory, his tactical mind collapsed. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was a realization that the war he had brought to this doorstep was a sacrilege against the life she had found. He remained a shadow among the thorns, a ruthless boss paralyzed by the simple heart-wrenching beauty of a girl training a puppy in the one place she should never be. The stillness of the garden was suddenly broken, not by the sound of gunfire, but by the heavy click of a latch above. Vittorio pressed deeper into the darkness of the trellis, his instincts screaming to raise his weapon, yet he remained paralyzed as a figure stepped onto the stone balcony overlooking the roses. It was Dante, the man Vittorio had spent a decade trying to erase from the earth. The rival boss didn't look like a man at war. He leaned against the railing with a glass of amber liquid, his gaze fixed on the girl below with an expression that was hauntingly familiar. It was the look of a guardian. In that moment, the deadliest enemies stood frozen in a silent, shared observation of an impossible sight. Vittorio watched as Dante nodded toward the girl, a ghost of a smile touching his lips as the puppy tumbled over her feet. The realization hit Vittorio with the force of a physical blow. His daughter hadn't been kidnapped or discarded, she had been hidden. His greatest rival had been the one to shield her from the very bloodbath Vittorio had been preparing to unleash. This wasn't a hostage situation, it was a sanctuary. The vengeance that had fueled Vittorio for 10 years began to rot in his chest. He saw the way Dante's eyes scanned the perimeter, not for Vittorio's men, but for any threat to the girl's peace. The man he had come to kill had been playing the role of the puppet master, orchestrating a life for her that was free from the stains of her father's world. As the girl laughed again, commanding the dog with a gentle confidence, Vittorio saw the truth in the shadows. He was torn between starting a war with the man who had stolen her and shedding tears for the man who had saved her. This miracle he had found in enemy territory was a debt he could never repay, turning his carefully planned rescue into a silent moment of awe that threatened to bridge a lifelong gang war. Dante continued to watch her, unaware that his enemy was mere yards away, both men anchored by the same fragile golden light in the heart of the garden. Watching her from the darkness, Vittorio felt the decades of ice around his heart begin to fracture. The way she tilted her head while praising the puppy was a ghost of a gesture he hadn't seen since she was 6 years old. In his mind, he was suddenly back in a sun-drenched courtyard far from this rival's garden, watching a much smaller version of her chase butterflies while he cleaned a Beretta on the porch. Back then she had been his lost heir, a creature of pure light who saw the world as a place of wonder, entirely oblivious to the fact that her father was the world's most dangerous man. He remembered the sticky touch of her hands after eating peaches and the way she would demand he read her stories, her innocence a shield that he believed would protect him from the monster he was becoming. But the world of the mafia does not allow for such shields. As the lifelong gang war intensified, Vittorio had traded those golden afternoons for midnight meetings and blood-soaked ledgers. He had convinced himself that his brutality was a fence he was building around her, but in reality he was only feeding a darkness that would eventually swallow them both. While he was becoming a man who hadn't felt a heartbeat in years, she remained anchored in a world of gentle commands and soft laughter. The contrast was a jagged blade. She was sitting among the roses, calmly commanding a puppy with the same effortless kindness she had possessed as a child. She had no idea that the man watching her from the shadows had spent the last 10 years becoming a creature of pure vengeance. He was a ruthless mafia boss who had scaled a perimeter wall expecting a bloodbath, yet she was the living proof that his path had been a failure. She still possessed the miracle of innocence, a trait he had long ago discarded to survive the underworld. Standing there, torn between starting a war and shedding tears, Vittorio realized that while he had been training men to kill, she had been training herself to live. The impossible sight of her joy was a silent indictment of the monster he had become, a reminder that the daughter he lost was the only part of him that had ever truly been gold. Vittorio remained perfectly still, his silhouette melding into the jagged shadows of the rose garden as he watched the girl playfully command the puppy. He was a man who had come for a bloodbath, a ruthless boss who had scaled the perimeter wall with vengeance in his heart, yet he found himself paralyzed by a miracle. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and roses, but the silence was suddenly charged with a different kind of electricity. Slowly, as if sensing the presence of another predator, Dante turned his head. From his vantage point on the balcony, the rival boss let his gaze drift from the girl to the dense thicket of thorns where Vittorio stood hidden. The two deadliest enemies stood frozen, their eyes locking across the moonlit expanse in a silent standoff that held the weight of a lifelong gang war. There was no reach for a weapon, no shout for guards. There was only a profound, heavy recognition. Dante's expression was not one of fear, but of a grim, protective challenge. He looked at Vittorio with the eyes of a man who had guarded an impossible secret for a decade, silently daring the father to shatter the peace of the girl sitting between them. Vittorio, the world's most dangerous man, felt the weapon in his hand become an alien weight. He was torn between the war he had spent years preparing for and the tears he had forgotten how to shed. Below them, the lost heir remained entirely oblivious to the two monsters watching over her. She laughed again as the golden retriever puppy lunged for a blade of grass, her joy a bright, fragile barrier that kept the two men from tearing each other apart. She had no idea her father was watching, nor that his presence in the heart of enemy territory had turned a rescue mission into a moment of silent awe. The garden became a neutral ground, a sanctuary where the past and present collided. Across the distance, Dante's grip tightened on the balcony railing, a silent signal that the girl's happiness was the only thing that mattered. In that long, wordless exchange, the bloodbath Vittorio had expected vanished, replaced by the realization that any move he made would be a strike against the very miracle he had found. The tension in the garden shifted from a threat of violence to a heavy, suffocating clarity as Dante broke the silence. He didn't call for his guards or reach for a weapon. Instead, he spoke in a voice barely louder than the rustle of the rose petals, his eyes never leaving the girl below. He revealed the truth that shattered Vittorio's remaining illusions. His daughter had not been taken by force, nor was she a victim of a lost heir kidnapping. She was there because she had chosen to disappear. On that blood-soaked afternoon a decade ago, she hadn't been snatched by a rival. She had fled the shadows of her father's empire, terrified by the ruthless mafia boss he had become. Dante had found her shivering and alone, not as a prize to be used in a lifelong gang war, but as a child who begged never to go back to a home that smelled of gunpowder and grief. He had provided her a refuge in this garden, keeping her existence a secret even from his own men to ensure she remained untouched by the world's deadliest enemies. Vittorio felt the weight of his vengeance turn to ash in his mouth. He had spent 10 years becoming the world's most dangerous man to avenge a girl who had actually been hiding from him. The revelation was a miracle wrapped in a tragedy. As she sat there, calmly commanding a puppy in the heart of enemy territory, Vittorio realized she was happy because she was far away from his legacy. She wasn't a prisoner of his rival, she was a refugee from his own violence. The lost heir wasn't lost at all, she was exactly where she needed to be to keep her laughter untainted. Vittorio, standing torn between starting a war and shedding tears, finally understood that his rescue mission was a lie. He hadn't come to save her from a rival. He had inadvertently come to threaten the only peace she had ever known. The unexpected discovery wasn't just that she was alive, but that the man he hated most had been a better father to her than he could ever hope to be. Vittorio felt the cold weight of the handgun in his grip, a tool that had defined his existence for a decade, and slowly opened his palm. The metal clattered against the stone floor of the garden path, a sound that, in any other context, would have been a death knell. But here, in the presence of the daughter who had fled his shadow, it was the only currency he had left to offer. He looked up at Dante, the man who had been the puppet master of her safety, and for the first time in his life, the world's most dangerous man sued for peace. There would be no bloodbath tonight. The vengeance in his heart had vanished as he watched her laugh among the roses. The negotiation that followed was not one of territories or drug routes, but of fragile human boundaries. Standing in the heart of enemy territory, Vittorio had to accept a devastating truth. His reputation was a poison that his daughter had spent years trying to sweat out. To earn even a glimpse of her life, he had to dismantle the very empire he had built to protect her. Dante remained on the balcony, his silhouette a grim sentinel, demanding a price higher than any ransom Vittorio had ever paid. The price of peace was the death of the boss and the slow, uncertain rebirth of a father. She believes you died in the war you loved so much. Dante's voice drifted down, cold and unwavering. Vittorio closed his eyes, torn between the urge to reclaim his lost heir and the realization that his presence was a threat to her miracle. he had to negotiate his own obsolescence. He agreed to pull his men from the borders to end the lifelong gang war, and to remain a ghost, watching from the periphery until he could prove he was no longer the monster she had fled. As the girl continued to train the puppy, oblivious to the high-stakes emotional twist occurring above her, Vittorio stood unarmed and humbled. He was no longer a conqueror. He was a man begging for the right to one day stand in the light of her garden without casting a shadow of blood. The violence that had defined Vittorio's existence for decades did not end with a final explosion, but with a heavy, deliberate silence. He dismantled his empire piece by piece, trading his territories for a fragile truce that finally brought the lifelong gang war to a close. The man who was once the world's most dangerous man became a ghost in his own city, a figure moving through the periphery of a life he was no longer allowed to touch. He had come to the rival's garden expecting to perform a rescue mission, but the unexpected discovery of his daughter's happiness had taught him a bitter lesson. The only person she truly needed to be rescued from was the man he used to be. Vittorio stood now on a distant ridge, watching through a lens as his daughter, the lost heir he had thought gone forever, continued her life in the sanctuary of the roses. She was older, wiser, and still possessed that miracle of innocence that he had long ago discarded. He watched her throw a ball for the golden retriever puppy, her laughter drifting on the wind like a melody he didn't deserve to hear. She had no idea her father was watching, torn between starting a war and shedding tears, but he had finally chosen the latter. He realized that to truly rescue her, he had to undergo a transformation that no bullet or blade could achieve. The vengeance in his heart had not just vanished. It had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve to change. He was no longer the ruthless mafia boss who scaled perimeter walls expecting a bloodbath. Instead, he was a man learning the patience of the gardener, waiting in the shadows not to strike, but to ensure that the miracle he found remained safe. This wasn't the end of his story, but the beginning of a new one, a silent moment of awe that had successfully bridged a war and given a monster a reason to become a man. He pulled his collar up against the morning chill and turned away, leaving her to her roses and her puppy, knowing that the greatest act of love he could offer was the distance she required to keep her smile. The story of Vittorio and his daughter is a powerful testament to the idea that even the most hardened hearts can be dismantled by a single moment of pure, unexpected humanity. What began as a mission for blood and fire ended in a silent moment of awe that redefined a man's entire legacy. By choosing the price of peace over the cycle of a lifelong gang war, Vittorio proved that the ultimate act of power isn't the ability to destroy an enemy, but the strength to change for the sake of love. If this story of redemption and the high-stakes emotional twist moved you, please like this post and share it with anyone who loves a narrative where hope triumphs over vengeance. We want to hear from you. Do you think Vittorio made the right choice by staying in the shadows, or should he have approached her? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.